So I'm in the middle of a lot of series. As you can tell if you watched any of my TBRs, I'm reading a lot of really long series. And I figured I'd tell you guys what everything I'm in the middle of, what I'm planning on reading, when I'm planning on reading some of these series, to inform. And if you want to read these series with me, you can. Hi, I'm Pete. This is the Ponderings of Pete. I read fantasy, I read sci-fi, I read some nonfiction. I read a bunch of stuff. And this is kind of like the big stuff that I'm in the middle of. Just wanted to give an update on some of the stuff. I feel like if you watch a lot of my videos, you probably put together a lot of these series. But some of them I've started previously, but never really continued with them. So let's talk about it. The first series that comes to mind when I think about series that I'm kind of in the middle of is actually Wheel of Time. So I started Wheel of Time. First off, what is Wheel of Time? Start with the basics. Wheel of Time is your classic epic fantasy. It's classic, hi, you're a kid in a village. This kid Rand is the chosen one to save the world. Or is he? We don't know. He seems like it. He's this thing, I think it's called the Dragon Reborn. And he brings his friends along for the ride. You have your classic old wizard-ish, that's a woman in this case, the Aes Sedai kind of control a lot of the world, I think. Can't remember. And there's this great evil. And this is kind of I feel like this is a really bad summary of it, but this is kind of like where it starts off with an eye of the world. And I know it gets a little bit more complex as time goes on because it's a 14-book series. So complexity is introduced. It's one of the biggest series ever in fantasy because of the thousands of characters that are introduced over 14 books. I think it's a little over 1,000. I could be wrong, but it's ginormous. I started this series back in college. I think I read the first 4 books. I was like, okay, this is cool. But I ended up DNFing it in college. And this isn't because I didn't like the books. It's there was a few series, you'll see this repeated in others of this. I started them in college, but I DNF'd them because I didn't read them consistently. And I stopped reading them because I was busy with school and work and some other stuff. And then I forgot where I was. So I either forgot where I was or I felt like I didn't remember enough about the series to continue on picking up where I was. So currently my plans with Wheel of Time, I'm actually going to start it in November with Eye of the World and continue on with at least 1 book a month from November on. So that's going to take me till 2023 for certain because that's 14 or 15 books. I think I have all except one of them. I haven't been able to find a copy of Towers of Midnight yet for some odd reason. I also haven't been looking too hard because it's not that urgent. You know, I have over a year until I get to that, so I have time. The second book, the second series that I've started, just like Wheel of Time, I started it while I was in college because I was like, ooh, cool, let's read this. And I got a few books in, and then I just kind of fell off because I was like, I don't remember enough about the series to continue it. Realm of the Elderlings by Robin Hobb. This book series is actually not just one book series. It's a bunch of trilogies and 1 quartet. So there's a total of 16 books. And it takes place in this fantasy world with multiple different types of magic. Some of the magic is outlawed. I think most of it is. And then other magic is lost. And they have these things called live ships in some of the books where you have ships with like talking figureheads, which is really cool. And at some point there's dragons because there's an entire dragons series. It's good. It starts off with the Farseer trilogy. I read Assassin's Apprentice and Royal Assassin. I read the first 2 books in the Farseer trilogy, which they were painful. There's a lot of trauma going on in that book, a lot of just pain and torture that our main character Fitz goes through. And I remember really, really liking them. And I probably remember more of the Farseer trilogy than I do of Eye of the World. So I technically probably could start it sooner. I could probably start with Assassin's Quest and be fine. But I kind of want to go and reread the first 2 books just because they were so good. I want to refresh my memory. I actually don't plan on starting that until after the Wheel of Time. So this will be 2023. I'm going to start with those. And those books, I think I will probably do like a trilogy, take a break of a month, and then continue on with the next trilogy and so on and so forth. I've heard lots of good things about this. The Farseer trilogy is good. Live Ship Traders, I've heard a lot about on Booktube recently. People really loving that. That's also a good place to start if you can't connect with the Farseer trilogy as much because It's kind of separate. It doesn't follow Fitz and other people. It's a completely separate trilogy. So yeah, that'll be 2023 probably. I might bump it up on the TBR if I feel like I have time, but if that really, you'll see why I won't have time, because I think I can only take about like maybe 2 giant series at a time, and you'll see why in a second. The next books that I'm going to talk about is I actually finished them, all that was released, but because the last one is coming out soon, putting it on this list, and that is The Expanse. This is going to be a 9-book series plus a bunch of short stories, and it is a sci-fi series set in kind of not like the far future, but not like really, really close. The humans have colonized our solar system. A far future sci-fi would be, hey, we've expanded past our solar system. We've been there for a while. But in this series, we have not expanded past our solar system. We have multiple different political factions of the belt, which is the asteroid belt beyond. We have Mars, and then we have Earth as our main kind of just factions to start out with. First book in Leviathan Wakes, we come into contact with something interesting that is apparently it's a disease, from what we can tell in the beginning. And this series really focuses on the human reactions to certain things. So it will focus on different people and different, whether they're archetypes or just people in general, or factions of people, whether it's certain factions of the government, so on and so forth. How people react to a lot of different sci-fi situations. And the characters aren't always logical. They don't always do exactly what you think they should do, but they do what they think is right. There's a character in particular, James Holden, that Pete is kind of known for being frustrated because he can be a little bit self-righteous sometimes, because he thinks he can fix everything. Check it out. I think over time, this series has been grown a little bit closer to my heart. It's written by James S.A. Corey, which is Ty Frank and Daniel Abraham, who wrote the Long Price Quartet. I think they do a really good job with this. Book 9 is coming out this November, and I do plan on reading it close to that. Probably not in November, because I have specific plans for November that don't involve like reading a lot of books, but I definitely plan on getting to that at some point, because I've read 8 out of 9 books. Book 8 set up for a bit of a finally moment in Leviathan Falls, and I'm really excited for it because it's going to be a very good culmination, I hope. The next series I'm going to talk about, I've been talking about a lot. I've started doing more videos on it, and I'm excited because I've been wanting to, because it's been blowing my mind. That is Malazan. So when I say Malazan, I don't just mean Malazan Book of the Fallen, because that is a big chunk of the Malazan book series universe, but it is not the only chunk. It's not even the main chunk. Calling Malazan Book of the Fallen the main series is kind of, there's so much more. If you're going to get into Malazan, I would definitely start with Malazan Book of the Fallen, but there's also a lot of reading orders that you can read all the books in a certain order and it'll make sense. Total, I think right now there are 25 or 26 total books in the Malazan universe. Currently, I am going through Malazan Book of the Fallen, which is these big chunker books that are just, there's 10 of them, and it's a really, really epic series. It's very different. The first book, the way I describe it is, it drops you in the middle of a war with zero context. I was digging it from the first book. I really, really got attached to it in book 3, and there's a lot of different resources out there to help people get through. Like there's a PowerPoint to help you get through the entire series, because there's a lot of detail in this series, and there's a lot of just moving parts, and it doesn't have your typical predictable structure that a lot of other series have. It doesn't even necessarily have one big bad. I say that without having finished the series, but there's a lot of different factions. There's a lot of different, the Malazan Marines, the warfare in this series is excellent. There's multiple different sieges that have stuck with me in my mind. It's very heavily, there's a lot of heavy magic as well in it too. So that gets thrown at you. It's a soft magic system as well. So that leads to a bit of a mystery to some things. So definitely go in this looking at it like a puzzle, or that's one way to look at it and enjoy it, I would say. So currently I am reading Dust of Dreams, which is book 9 of 10 for Malazan Book of the Fallen. And yeah, I'm not going to stop there. So I actually am planning on doing a reread of the 10 Malazan Book of the Fallen books and missed doing all the other books. So starting next January, I'm planning on finishing Cripple God in November. No, October. Dust of Dreams is probably going to roll into October, but I'm doing that in Cripple God. Hopefully that won't take too long, but we'll see. They're thick. Finish that up in October. And then in January, I'm going to start the Path to Ascendancy series by Ian C. Esselmont. The two authors, he's one of the two authors. Steve Erickson is the other one. Erickson is author's Malazan Book of the Fallen, and then Esselmont does a lot of other different novels of the Malazan Empire, and then Path to Ascendancy. Erickson has worked on the Carcanus trilogy, and then he's also working on the Witness trilogy as well. So by the time I get to the end of all 25 of these books, which will be a 1-a-month schedule, which is what I typically do, because that allows me to flex between different things with my TBR, and if I need to skip a month and move it on, I do that. But once I do that, it'll probably be like 2024, 2025 by the time I get there. So we're in for a long haul, folks. Get ready for some Malazan content. Next up is a series I recently started, and that is the Books of Babel, starting with Senlin Ascends and continuing with Arm of the Sphinx, The Hod King, and finally concluding in a few months with The Fall of Babel's release. This book was really hyped up on book 2, but I was kind of nervous about reading it because I hadn't really heard that many negative things, but it definitely is a book that lived up to the hype for me, just because there's an interesting structure to it, and just the way the way he tells the story is great. I'm really looking forward to continuing with Arm of the Sphinx, which I know changes up a lot of the dynamics that are in Senlin Ascends, because it turns from a single POV in Senlin Ascends to a multi-POV in Arm of the Sphinx, which will be interesting to see, because I know I've heard some of the characters that will be main characters there, and that makes me excited, because those were some interesting characters. There's definitely a lot of mystery surrounding the Tower of Babel. I should probably tell you what it's about, though. I keep forgetting that. So Senlin Ascends starts off with Thomas Senlin, a school teacher, going on his honeymoon with his wife to the Tower of Babel. So this is a magical, like you could call it magical realism, alternate history. There's a lot of different boxes this could check, simply because like the Tower of Babel was not torn down like it was, or was not incomplete like it was. It is historically known as. It is known as this pillar of humanity. Thomas Senlin views it as a pillar of humanity, morality, of this is peak civilization. But as his wife disappears within the first 10 minutes of them stepping on the ground, everything changes for him. He realizes things, he learns things. He starts out pretty naive, but even by the end of book 1, he's not as naive as people tend to say about this book. That's kind of like the only thing that's kind of different that I've noticed. So yeah, it's really good. I think it's really well written. Definitely gives me vibes of Jules Verne, which is one of the influences on the author since he was a young guy. And there's a few other adventure romps that he's listed as influences as well that makes me like, yes, I understand you, sir. The next series I'm going to talk about, I started last December. This is the Powder Mage Trilogy by Brian McClellan. Read this with shelf space back in December, and it was okay. I thought the first chapter was amazing. The rest of it was like, it was good, but it wasn't great. I want to continue. I've definitely heard there are some of his other series that actually improved. This was his first series. And there's definitely some things that are only so-so about the series. He felt like Sanderson Light to me. He was a student of Brandon Sanderson's, so it does make sense that it felt like Sanderson Light. That's just how it is. So I have the books. I want to continue with them. We will see when I do continue with them. I think next year I will start being like, okay, are there any tiny trilogies that I can start just knocking off my list? As I knock off these big books like Wheel of Time and Realm of the Elderlings. Next up, another series I recently got into because the books are smaller, but there's still a bunch of them, and that is Shadows of the Apt by Adrian Tchaikovsky. Shadows of the Apt, I started it as a part of Alan at the Library of Allenxandria's August of the Apt. This is his current read-along. We're going through 4 of the 10-book series. Because I already am interested and invested, am going to continue on with all 10 because I want to. So 10-book series, yeah. 1 a month, per usual. Started back in August. Hopefully I will finish up around mid-2022. What's it about? It's about a war. In this it's in a fantasy world, obviously, where humanity and civilization has evolved around this concept of more insectoid concepts. And specifically, they have a magic system, which they don't call magic because it's normalized to them, where you can gain aspects of specific ancestral insects through meditation. So, for instance, the humans, because these are all humans that are called mantis kindred, mantis kind, can grow barbs along their arms, which is to aid them in combat. Multiple different races can gain flight because bugs fly. Some of them do. The wasps can gain stingers, but what they call stingers are literally just bolts of magic coming out of their palms. So they're just firing little firebolts out of their palms, which is really cool. The Wasp Kingdom, the Wasp Empire, is trying to take over the world, you could say. They're trying to expand their borders. They're trying to invade other countries. And our story starts after they're well on their way of their conquest. And they're turning their sights to what's called the Lowlands, where there are a lot of ant kindred cities, as well as our kind of base for the story, the Collegium, which you could consider kind of like a fantasy Athens. There's the university, and it is run, literally the entire city is run by this university, the center of learning. So it's kind of adjacent to Flintlock Fantasy in the sense that they're actually starting to have guns, develop guns. They're starting to develop these, they call them nail bows. Anything that shoots things is called a bow, which is kind of funny. They're developing ornithopters. They call them heliopters, I think. But flying machines, they're developing so much more technology because of just the aptitude of certain races. And there's actually another separate magic called magic that there's two different types of races. You could be apt or you can be non-apt. The non-apt races are the magic users. These are the moth, the mosquito, the slug. Most of these, and I'm throwing out a bunch of races that I know are sorceress races. Not all of them appear in these books. They're just briefly mentioned. Like, there's a lot of races that are briefly mentioned that don't really show up. It's crazy. The moth are definitely in there, though. Then you can also be an apt race, which would be ants, beetles, and there's others. Apt versus non-apt tells you their level of aptitude with technology, to the point that some of the non-apt races can't even turn a normal door handle because it's too technological for them. It's kind of a weird mental magical block, I think, which is interesting. So it's a fascinating world. The sieges are brilliant because eventually there are sieges because it is a war, but I really can't tell you more than that. I think some of the characters are really good, have some interesting story structures. I do think he needs work on some of his characters after reading book 2. But, I've heard good things about some of his other works as well. And this man is a machine. So I'm going to keep reading some Tchaikovsky. This was actually his first published work, so it's rough, but forgivable. So the next series I'm going to talk about is one that another one that I started recently and really been liking. And it's a self-published series and really shows you why self-publish is great. Like, it's a series that I can't see a normal publisher, big box publisher, taking a risk on because it's so different, and that is Fred, the Vampire Accountant. It's so good, guys. It's great. We follow Fred, who is a tax accountant, and he's just boring and normal, and then he gets turned into a vampire, and he stays boring, just undead. And, well, his life, I wouldn't say is boring, but he is disappointed that he did not turn into magically suave and attractive Mr. Vampire that is portrayed in fiction normally. So this is an urban fantasy tale. It reads like it's a bunch of short stories in his life. They're all chronologically placed. There's a great element of found family that's really heartwarming. And he just kind of like dives into this new world and finds friends and more than friends. And it's really cool. So check it out. This is kind of like a palate cleanser book for me because they don't take that long to read. You can read one short story at a time. But there's like 7 books in the series, so it's really great. Check it out. The next one is another self-published series that I want to talk about, which I started reading, and that is the Future's Birth series by S.J. Saunders. So he sent me these in exchange for an honest review. So I read the first one of them recently. Still gotta finish that review, but I do plan on getting to it. So what is this about? This is kind of feels like a bread and butter RPG type of fantasy series. It starts out, you got 3 different characters that come close to meeting in a tavern. They do meet in a tavern. They're given a job to do, and political intrigue and craziness ensues. So I was told that this, and from multiple different sources, that this kind of starts out small with like just this stuff going on in this one town, and then gets larger and larger in scope as time goes on, which is exciting. I'm excited to see that. I definitely felt really close to like a D&D or an RPG experience. Some of the pacing felt like that. The characters were decent. The characters, and there's 1 or 2 that stood out to me. Definitely have some interesting, some of them slightly tropey issues in terms of like RPG tropes. But yeah, it's good. Check it out. Book 6 just came out, which is why he was looking for people to read it. So yeah, stay tuned for more thoughts and reviews on that. Next up is a series that I started. I think I probably read the first one in college, but I've read it 3 times by now, because I keep trying to read it to read the next one. I actually just started the next one. That is Dune. I read Dune Messiah this past month, and I really, really loved it. That's book 2. And I'm really, 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 really stoked for the movie to come out, because this is going to be part 1 of part 2 of Dune. It's really cool, and I'm excited. Dune, as an older sci-fi, is phenomenal. There's a lot of depth to Dune. The more you read it, the more you understand it, and the more you talk about it with people. It's so nice just to talk to people about it, because it is very subversive in the themes that it portrays. And this is for an older sci-fi, so kind of, if you think subversion of tropes is something that newer people do, but Frank Herbert's got it. I do plan on reading the rest of the series, at least Frank Herbert's 6, starting with Children of Dune next month. So I got 4 more to go. We'll see if I want to continue on with his sons and Kevin J. Anderson's continuations after that. The next one is another kind of older, I think. It's the Hyperion Cantos. Definitely, I think it was published in the 90s probably, because it has that 90s feel to its cover. Hyperion is interesting. I read the first one. Again, I read the first one after college, actually. So while I was at my first accounting job. And man, this is such really unique. It reads like the Canterbury Tales. There are 6 people. They're all connected to this being called the Shrike, which is basically just this being that looks like a bunch of metal weird spikes and blades and stuff. And it lives on this planet of Hyperion. And all 6 of these are connected to this dude, and they're going to see the Shrike for some odd reason. So what happens is they take time to each of them tell their tale about how they're connected to the Shrike. Some of the tales are really interesting, some are really good, some of them are just plain weird, but all in all, it's a really good, I think it's a good older sci-fi. I do look forward to continuing, just because the conclusion of it all, and definitely check it out. It's really, really unique. Next one I'm going to talk about is the Gentleman Bastard series. The first one is Liza Lamora. It definitely feels like it's about 2 friends that are part of essentially a thieving guild of some sorts, group, tiny organization. There's like 5 or 6 of them. There aren't that many, but they're kind of Robin Hood-esque. They steal from the rich, give to the poor, sort of, to some extent. The society is very interestingly complicated. I read the first 2 in college, and then didn't finish the 3rd one during college because I got overwhelmed and then didn't remember where I was. I didn't really want to reread the first quarter of it at the time, because I got a good bit in. Scott Lynch has crafted a very vibrant and unique and interesting fantasy world. The city that the first one takes place in feels kind of like fantasy Venice, which is so interesting because there's a lot of sharks, which is cool. And the different criminal and law-abiding factions within that first book really interact well. There's a heist, there's political machinations, and it's very low magic. Like, the magic is not really it comes into play in certain instances with certain characters, but it's not like the main characters have all this magic and stuff. So, got your sword and sorcery, duking it out in the streets type of magic series here. And then the next series is also kind of similar to a certain extent, because you got the 2 kind of main characters are good friends, and that is the Library of Revelations by Michael J. Sullivan. And this used to be self-published, I believe, at one point. I read this back in December with shelf space, and I was intrigued. The first one, The Crown Conspiracy, you have these two mercenaries, thieves, people. They get caught up in a conspiracy involving secession of a certain nation state, city-state, I think it is. So they're caught up there as whatever, and they have to redeem their names from what they're accused of. That's the first one, The Crown Conspiracy. It's a 2-book bind up for the first book, but I thought it was very interesting. I'm intrigued to learn more to go forward in the future. Yeah, you've got your fantasy world. One of them might be some sort of chosen one, I think, based on revelations, I think, in one of the books. But so that intrigues me because it's going to go interesting places. So check that out. He's also got a really good series that I've heard of. I think it's a prequel series. It's more high magic than the Library of Revelations. Library of Revelations, I'm pretty sure, at least in the first book, you don't see any magic at all. Second book, I think you see a little bit. It's good. So this next series that I started, I'm trying to recommend to everybody I can because it's so, it's different. It's called A Natural History of Dragons by Marie Brennan. The first book, I've only read the first book, but I really want to continue because it's so comforting. It's Indiana Jones and Jane Austen, primarily more Jane Austen, because you get a fantasy Edwardian society combined with something else that I can't tell you without spoiling it, combined with for science. So the concept of this is Lady Trent is writing her memoirs, and she is a world-renowned dragonologist. She studies dragons, and she's essentially telling her stories about her rise to prominence from in a Jane Austen Edwardian society where women are figureheads, or just not figureheads, but they're arm candy or whatever. They don't really have that much say in anything about what they do. They're expected to sit at home and knit, but she's a scientist. True and true from a young age. So she has to struggle against that, and it tells about her husband, and it tells about just going on an expedition to look at dragons when dragons haven't really been studied as much in the wild as other beasts. So yeah, this is a beautifully written book, and you should definitely check it out. Check out the series. It's really, really good. I feel like I'm doing things in twos as well, because I had two self-published, 2 older sci-fi, 2 buddy fantasies, and now we have 2 dragon fantasies. This next series that I started the first one, I think right before I started book 2, but that is the Temeraire series, starting with His Majesty's Dragon. This is Dragon Riders plus Napoleonic Wars. So it starts in the middle of the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon is becoming a major. He's starting to take over more than just France, and there are dragons, which is such an interesting concept. I read the first one, which was kind of lower on the dragon fighting that I wanted, but that was because of certain things that were happening in the first book. So I'm excited to continue on, see if it has more of the fun stuff there at some point. Again, I have a lot on my plate, and I just can't get to everything immediately, even though I might want to. The last kind of actual series that I'm going to talk about is another really fun series, really funny series that I read the first one, but there's a lot of books, and that is Discworld by Terry Pratchett. I read Guards, and I've read Color of Magic back in the day. Color of Magic I read, I think, right out of college, and I was like, oh, this is okay. Then I read Guards, and I was and I was like, oh, this is a lot better than Color of Magic. I started with the City Watch stuff. I want to read more of that, get to know Vimes and Lady Sybil more. I also want to read the Death series. I want to get to it. I just need to find a spot where I can put them in as palette cleansers. I don't have that spot yet because I may or may not be prioritizing Fred the Vampire Slayer over this because... And I said Fred the Vampire Slayer, but I really mean Fred the Vampire Accountant because he's not a vampire slayer because he doesn't kill himself because... Yeah. That's an interesting concept. But yeah, so those are... Fred the Vampire Accountant are kind of my comedic palette cleansers right now. Once I get done with those, definitely Discworld is going to go to the forefront for that, so I can keep reading those. Discworld, if you're wondering what it is, written by Sir Terry Pratchett. It is a on-the-nose take on fantasy. Everything is literally just making fun of fantasy tropes, fantasy things, and it's just fantasy making fun of fantasy, which is really, really great. There's definitely, real world commentary at some point in some of these books, I think, considering some of the subjects that I've heard about. But yeah, check it out. It's really funny, really, really famous. The last one I want to talk about is kind of like I've started bits and pieces of this, but it's not one series, but this is the expanded universe of Star Wars, which I think when I got out of college was the first thing I started collecting. One of the first things I started collecting, because I was like, I read these when I was a kid. I want to have all of them, and I want to have the hardcovers because those are harder to find. So I have a lot of them that I haven't read, and I want to read more of. I think there's definitely a few series. I've started the New Jedi Order series. I got like 6 books in before I started BookTube. And this was months and months before I started BookTube that I stopped reading that. I just kind of got burnt out for a little bit, and I wasn't of Star Wars because I was reading books back to back and back. So, I did read. I knew I started off reading some other Thrawn books. I want to read the Bounty Hunter Wars. I think it's called the Bounty Hunter Wars. That series is probably the first series I'll read. I'd like to start reading those maybe in the new year is when I'll start reading them. I'm trying to cut down my physical TBR next year. Cut down and finish the series I have, finish the series that I need to get through. But yeah, that's kind of like the series I've started and that I want to complete. Hopefully next year this list will have gone down, but we'll see. So this is my 2021 series I'm in the middle of list. Have you read these series? Do you like these series? Do you hate these series? Tell me more, please, in the comments. Most importantly, get some rest. Thank you very much.